In today's lecture, we're going to cover personality. We're going to look into what makes up our personality, what are some theories along the lines of how we develop, and how can we assess for personality in the realm of clinical psychology. So, basic definition here: personality is a unique and relatively stable pattern of thoughts, feelings, and actions. It's essentially what is most consistent about a person over a pretty decent period of time. And you'll see as we cover some different theories that different theorists have varying ideas in terms of how stable personality is, at least of how much carries over throughout the lifespan versus changing moment to moment. So first up, we got trait theories. A trait is something that's relatively stable, this personal characteristic that's used to describe somebody. Some early figures, early trait theorists include Allport, Kittel, and Eysenck, but more modern trait theorists, McCrae and Costa, they developed what they call the five-factor model. It's a pretty popular, well-known model of personality. However, it's not nearly as widely used as some other theories that we'll cover later, but still great to look at and important to consider because it's very relevant to the different relationships that we hold in our lives. So five-factor model forms the acronym OCEAN, and that's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And with these different factors, they exist on essentially a continuum. And as you'll see on the next slide, that it's not necessarily whether you are open or not, or agreeable or not, but it's essentially to what degree are you an extrovert versus an introvert? To what degree are you neurotic versus being emotionally stable and easygoing? So here are some examples for each of the big five traits. So you can see on openness, low scores tend to be down to earth, not very creative, pretty conventional, and they're not very curious about the world. They seem to know what's going on. They're confident in the facts of the world and the way people behave and all of that. But high people, people who score very high on openness, are very imaginative, they're very creative, they're original, and they're curious. They aren't satisfied with the understanding that they currently possess about the world. They're very open to new experiences and a new understanding of what's going on around them. And you can take a look at each of these as we go down. I won't read through all of them, but again, it's important to consider that they are continuums, and they're not necessarily a are you or aren't you. So here's an activity. If you could kind of consider each of these big five traits and think about where you might fall on each one. If you have a piece of paper, you can feel free to kind of write it out and kind of guess like what would your profile look like. And then do the same for your ideal romantic partner. How much would you want somebody to be just like you in terms of their personality and their big five factors versus do you want them to kind of complement you in the sense that they kind of fill in the gaps that you possess. Perhaps you are more introverted and you would want someone who's very extroverted. And that's certainly a great exercise to consider. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment in terms of what research says that regarding whether that works out, having a partner who fills in those gaps and kind of lies on the opposite end of you. Another kind of fun activity to consider: how about Bruce Wayne and Batman? Think about Bruce Wayne and his personality, what his kind of day-to-day life is like. How open do you think he is? How conscientious is he? Is he introverted or extroverted? How agreeable is he? Is he very neurotic or not? And then consider the character of Batman. That between these two characters, can you find any differences among the five traits in terms of them essentially being like two different people? One, of course, is a lot more physically active than the other and fighting to get things done. But think about how if you could have a conversation with one person or the other, if you had 15 minutes to kind of chat with Bruce Wayne and 15 minutes to chat with Batman, would you find any differences in their personalities and how they come across? So kind of think about that and see if that helps maybe your understanding of of the big five, and how it really changes kind of person to person and moment to moment. So, regarding the five-factor model, the researchers asked over 10,000 men and women from 37 countries what they wanted in a mate. They found there was a high degree of agreement, and that the five-factor traits were at the top of both lists. So, what men want in a mate, they want mutual attraction, they want that feeling of love, they want a dependable character, emotional stability, maturity, pleasing disposition, good health, education and intelligence, and so on. What women want, they want the mutual attraction. They want that feeling of love, of dependable character, emotional stability, maturity. And then there begins to be a little bit of disagreement after pleasing disposition. Education, intelligence is a little bit higher, sociability is a little bit higher, good health maybe a little bit lower. But when you look at least the top four, they're exactly the same. And as we continue down the list, then then we begin to see a little bit of variance. Um, so important to consider with regards to how alike men and women are in terms of the traits that we want to find. And research does show that in general, that the more alike that a couple is, that the better it fares for the long term, that the relationship will stay together. That when you have a man and a woman who kind of complement each other in the sense that one is very quiet, one is very loud, one's very neat, one is very messy, and so on, that it's those differences that begin to kind of wear on a person's uh, resources and their energy levels, that when they're constantly being corrected because of their messiness, or the other person is feeling very anxious because their spouse can't keep a tidy room. It's the differences that begin to kind of wear on the relationship when each person realizes that as nice as it is to have somebody who compliments you, there's along with that comes a disruption of what a person expects in terms of their day-to-day lives. That if one spouse thinks my house is going to be clean and tidy, because that's the house that I want ideally, and you have somebody who has a very different, I want a comfortable house. I want someone to feel like that they could live here too because it's obviously lived in. Two very different concepts, but they're going to share that one house. Those differences can really wear on the relationship over the long term. So, some pros and cons about trait theories. The five-factor model helps in describing and organizing personality characteristics using the fewest number of traits. You got five things. They form a nice acronym of OCEAN, and so they're easy to understand in terms of how they fit into a person. It's also evolutionary. It's cross-cultural, cross-species. These studies support the five-factor model. That again, throughout the world, 10,000 people all agreeing that they possess certain qualities and that they want to seek those qualities out in others. However, the con of trait theories is that they lack much explanation. They're pretty thin. There's that question of stability versus change. That how much can a person change situation to situation, because it doesn't really it doesn't really account for those situational effects. That it it the five-factor model essentially argues that while a person could change a bit over time or in certain scenarios, that it doesn't account for role changes in a sense that we'll see is a hallmark to other theories later on in this lecture. So a little activity here: does your personality match your work? Consider some of the personality factors that you possess and think about, does it fit the ideal career that either you're seeking or that you perhaps are currently in or that you desire. If we have someone who's shy, genuine, persistent, stable, conforming, and practical, this is a very realistic personality type. They prefer physical activities that require skill, strength, and coordination. So this kind of a person will be a great mechanic, drill press operator, assembly line worker, farmer. You think about how shyness isn't necessarily a detriment to a job like being a farmer or an assembly line worker or a mechanic, where you will more likely be spending time with objects and things and less time with people, at least compared to other careers like social worker, psychologist, human resources, or lawyer, real estate agent, things like that. So you can take a look at some of the personality characteristics and see which one of those maybe closely aligns with you, as well as maybe some of the differences, and how does that align with uh, the the career that you've chosen. How congruent are they? Next up on our theories, we've got psychoanalytic and psychodynamic theories. These examine how unconscious mental forces interplay with thoughts, feelings, and actions. It's all about the unseen. And some early key figures are Sigmund Freud, the founding father of psychodynamic theory, rather psychoanalytic theory. Psychodynamic kind of comes out of it later, but that's splitting hairs. And then Neo-Freudians, we've got Adler, Jung, and Horney, which we'll look at all these in just a moment. So, basic psychoanalytic and psychodynamic theory holds this idea of multiple levels of consciousness. We have conscious thought, which is like the tip of the iceberg. These thoughts or motives, these are the thoughts or motives that a person is currently aware of or remembering. This is easily accessible. It's in their thought right now. You can ask them about it, and they'll report it right back to you. I am thinking about jelly beans. I'm thinking about going for a walk, and things like that. The preconscious is just below the surface of the water. You can still see it a little bit, but not nearly as clearly as the conscious. So these are thoughts, memories, or motives that can be voluntarily brought to mind. So you're not really ready to talk about it yet, but I can ask you and kind of probe and poke, and you'll be able to bring that out just with a little bit of help. Now the unconscious, this is the way below part of the iceberg, all under the water that we cannot see and we're not aware of. These thoughts, motives, and memories are blocked from normal awareness. And psychoanalytic and psychodynamic theory holds that it's in the unconscious that we possess these drives that that make us who we are, and the satisfaction or dissatisfaction of meeting those drives is the result of our personality. So some of these drives, these personality structures include the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is this kind of instinctual energy. The pleasure principle holds that we're always looking to satisfy something for ourselves. The id is essentially this kind of animalistic drive that always wants to satisfy hunger, thirst, sex. Ego is kind of the rational part of the psyche. The reality principle states that we can't always satisfy ourselves. We can't always please ourselves. That in reality, the world is different and rules are different, and so we've got to consider things before we just please ourselves. And lastly, the superego is the conscious mind. The morality principle, that this is kind of like the police officer or the strict parent. These are where all the rules lie in terms of how we should act and we're supposed to act. You think about the power of those words. You should act a certain way. You are supposed to. You're expected to be a certain way. All of those shoulds and expectations that are placed upon you form the superego, and it's basically the balance of the superego and the id, and that forms the much of who the person is in terms of can their ego balance that out. Can the ego listen to the id, listen to the superego, and say, okay, how can I satisfy these animalistic urges while still adhering to certain rules that I know exist? Things that there are some things I can do, some things I can't do, but how do I tell that to an animal inside of me? That's basically the ego's job. Now, defense mechanisms are an ego's protective method of reducing anxiety by distorting reality. That it's very difficult for the ego to satisfy both, and in fact, the ego can't. So that anxiety that exists between how do I satisfy this animalistic urge and how do I satisfy this what I should do and how I should act, and I can't give in to these animalistic urges according to the superego. How can I possibly make them both a little bit happy? Well, defense mechanism comes into place by distorting reality just a little bit so the ego can tolerate that anxiety in the moment. And here are some of the defense mechanisms that Freud and others have posited. Repression being that this is preventing painful or unacceptable thoughts from entering our consciousness. So if you forget the details of your parents' painful death, for example, Or sublimation, this is when you redirect unmet desires or unacceptable impulses into acceptable activities. So, for example, when you rechannel sexual desires into school, work, art, sports, hobbies that are constructive. So, we think about sex being primarily linked to procreation, continuing the human race and creating people. Sublimation would say, well, if you're having some sexual desires that you feel uncomfortable with and you feel like you cannot satisfy, instead find something else that's constructive, something that is creative, so you can still create something, but in a more socially acceptable channel that's going to satisfy you in the moment. And again, plenty of other defense mechanisms. Feel free to pause and take a look at these and their descriptions and the examples. All of these, again, are used to alleviate that anxiety that the ego feels for trying to satisfy the animal inside and the police officer inside. Freud also developed this idea of psychosexual stages. This is 5 developmental periods that are key to personality development. We have the oral stage, the anal stage, phallic stage, latency stage, and the genital stage. And as you'll see as we go through it, Freud really placed a lot of emphasis on the first few years of age, basically up until school. This is where everything that we experience, this all relates to our personality later in life, and that essentially the genital stage is the expression of much of these oral, anal, and phallic issues. Latency stage is just a stage that where he believed like nothing essentially happened, at least nothing worth noting happens. So again, he believes that all children pass through these 5 psychosexual stages, and that at each stage, the id's pleasure-seeking energies focus on specific pleasure areas of the body, these erogenous zones. In the oral stage, it's the first year and a half of life, the child is intensely focused on satisfying, on being fed and drinking and satisfying the mouth, whether sucking from a breast or a bottle or moving into foods. Mastering the ability to take care of oneself via the mouth. The only way we can continue living is by satisfying the mouth, by putting food into it and liquids into it. That Freud believed that this was paramount to human development later on. How much can we take care of ourselves, and how much can we, or can we, are we having difficulty mastering this physical ability? Are we not getting our needs met by those around us who are supposed to provide this nourishment for us? In the anal stage, about 18 months to 3 years of age, this is toilet training. It's think about the symbolism behind having this ugly thing inside of you, basically fecal matter, that you must release and you've got to say goodbye to. This is the idea behind the anal stage, that kids have to wrestle with the fact that they may have something disgusting in them and they've got to let it go. And that letting go and never seeing it again kind of thing is very important for a person to master. That if they can't let things go, they can be very anal retentive. And that's where that thought comes from, is that people get very anal and picky and have difficulty transitioning from situation to situation. They're not very open to new experiences, and Freud would argue that this is because of a disruption during the anal stage of development. The phallic stage occurs between 3 and 6 years of age. This is overcoming the Oedipus complex by identifying with the same-sex parent. The Oedipus complex primarily, well, exclusively relating to male children. The Electric complex is for female children, but the idea here is that this boy sees his father as a threat to the boy's relationship with the mother. That why is it that this grown man gets all this attention and I feel like I'm fighting him for it with my mom? And this is when the child first becomes aware of his or her genitals. And again, with females, it's kind of the flip side, that they align with, they want to be with their father, and they see the mom as a threat to that relationship as well. A lot of, as the name implies, a lot of focus on sex in Freud's theories of development. Latency stage, nothing happens. Essentially, that's kind of simplifying things, but really, this is just when kids interact with same-sex peers, and there's not a whole lot going on. There's no focus on the genitals or any other erogenous zones on the body. This is just, boys being boys, girls being girls. Lastly, we have the genital stage, and this occurs from puberty through adulthood, essentially around 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, all the way through the end of time. It's an all-encompassing kind of stage that goes throughout the lifespan of the adult, and this is essentially when we establish intimate relationships with the opposite sex. All of our previous issues and mastery comes out during the genital stage. That whatever occurred during the oral, anal, and phallic stage, we see uh, personified through the genital stage and our ability to form relationships with others. That if we have difficulty forming relationships with others, we can likely attribute it to an issue that occurred in an earlier stage. Next up, we got Adler, and he suggests that most people experience an inferiority complex, which later results in a will to power, that we have this drive to seek power and to become powerful. But this can be either positive or negative. The means through which we seek power, or to what purpose and what we want to satisfy and what we want to accomplish. How does this affect ourselves? How does it affect other people? This kind of will to power can mean quite a bit for a person's kind of moral standing. Jung proposed an inherited collective unconscious consisting of archetypes, that there's this symbolism in our culture and this way of understanding the world and each other that exists unconsciously. We think back to the iceberg example and how the unconscious mind is hidden from conscious awareness, and it's well below and requires a great deal of work to pull out. That Jung says that we have this as a culture, and throughout the whether it's the area in which you live, the city, the state, the country, the province, wherever, that the values you possess and what is important and what certain things mean, uh, again through symbolism, that these archetypes show up across cultures. Horney believed that adults experience a sort of basic anxiety due to childhood feelings of helplessness and isolation. That you think about kids and how they are essentially throughout the duration of childhood, we're seeking to develop mastery of the world around us. That everything is new in the world. That we don't, as adults, we often take for granted how much we already know about the way the world works, what's important to value, what's not important to value, what helps others, what hurts others, all of that. We've, of course, developed through our lifetime of living, but to an 8-year-old child or a 7-year-old child, they're still learning in that. There's still plenty of experiences that they've never gone through, and that there's this, and Horney believes that there's this kind of anxiety that underlies this when kids feel helpless or isolated, that they have unique experiences that their parents and older siblings and relatives simply cannot relate to or have difficulty relating to. Now, regarding psychoanalytic and psychodynamic theories and prose, it emphasizes the unconscious, kind of intrapsychic conflicts and development of influential therapy. That thanks to Sigmund Freud and his theory of development, personality development, he essentially developed the first true rich psychotherapy through psychoanalysis. That he was able to develop a method through helping others by helping them to explore their unconscious mind and to resolve some of their issues from childhood. And modern psychodynamic theories use more empirical methods. That today, psychodynamic psychologists have moved pretty far away from the Freudian way of thinking, at least in terms of absolute thinking. You'll be hard pressed to find any psychodynamic psychologist today who doesn't attribute a great deal of their understanding of the world and how we help each other and how we develop as people, uh, that you'll be hard to find anybody who doesn't attribute a great deal of that to Freud. They always pay it back to Freud, but we've come a long way in the 100 or so years since Freud was working on his theories, to the point where, again, today psychodynamic theorists have shifted their work to be more empirically based and not necessarily so hard set on sexual development. The con side, it can be a bit difficult to test because it requires adherence to the theory in the first place. Essentially, that how do I know if it's working? Well, it's working because I told you. And as long as you believe me, then you'll know it's working. So it can be a bit difficult to test if you don't align with the theory yourself, or at least can consider the possible validity of the theory. It does overemphasize biology and some unconscious forces. This whole idea that there are things that we cannot see and we're trying to pull out can be a bit foggy to understand, a bit difficult to understand, because it's kind of difficult to really make sense of people, because could it be that there's disagreement between different psychodynamic theorists in terms of explaining human development, as they're trying to look for something that isn't consciously there, that you're still pulling for these unconscious forces. There's kind of inadequate evidence over the long term that it's helpful. It's very sexist. Freud really relied quite a bit on the male experience of development when developing his theories of personality development, and there's kind of a lack of cross-cultural support. So his importance on the oral, anal, and phallic stages, and how they align with certain years of development, we don't see as being necessarily progressing in the same way in different cultures. For example, in some Native American cultures, it's believed that a child will develop mastery of what Freud would consider the anal stage of potty training once they get to school. That it will kind of naturally right itself by the time the child is about 6 years old. Now, again, Freud says no, it's pretty well done by 3, or kind of give and take a couple months, but again, we don't see that. It's hard to apply his theory to various cultures of the world. Now, humanistic theories emphasizes that personality develops from internal experiences, kind of feelings and thoughts, and individual feelings of basic worth. That people are innately good, or at worst, neutral, with a positive drive towards self-fulfillment. A couple key figures here are Rogers and Maslow. And this is the theory that I personally adhere to the most as a psychologist. I believe that Rogers and Maslow both have a great theory of personality development in terms of explaining the basic good in all of us. A key component of personality is the self, kind of what a person defines as I or me. So how do you develop your own identity and figure out who that person is? And mental health is related to the degree of congruence between the self-concept and life experiences. So we take a look at these circles, these like Venn diagrams on the side, that if the self-concept, basically how you define yourself, is congruent with your everyday experience of how the world is, and how the world reacts to you, how other people behave around you and who you think you are, if they're very congruent and they're very similar, that's a very well-adjusted individual, because there's a great deal of overlap between the self-concept and the experience. However, somebody who has an idea of who they are, and what they want in the world, and how they believe they exist in the world, if that's very different from the experience they get, from the feedback from loved ones, from coworkers and employers, and strangers and whatnot, that if their everyday experience is not very congruent to who they think they are and how they believe that they exist in the world, then that's a very poorly adjusted individual. That they aren't essentially meeting the needs that they have set forth for themselves as a person. And Rogers coined this key term, this unconditional positive regard. This is a form of love and acceptance with no contingencies attached. That we regard each other with positivity and basic human empathy, regardless of what the differences may be, or what our current situation may be. And this is an important communication for the therapist to pass along to a client, as Rogers believed, because it's through this unconditional positive regard, that just accepting you for who you are, regardless of what you do, that a person can start to get their self-concept and their experiences more intact and get them more congruent. Because I hold this basic understanding that you are a good person and that you will be successful. You just have some kind of hurdles along the way that are slowing you down. So let's try to achieve these goals together, and see um, how our experiences can again better align with our self concept. So as a child, think about your experiences. Were they primarily conditional or unconditional positive regard? That was it based on what you did, or your personality expressions as a person, um, and what you spoke of, and whatnot? Was it based on those conditions, or was it basic acceptance and positive regard that was communicated unconditionally? So, thinking about what Roger says, how might this have affected your adult personality and how you express it? Now, Maslow created this idea, this notion of the hierarchy of needs, that we have this kind of basic physical necessities must be satisfied before higher growth needs. That we look up the pyramid, and in order to build a pyramid, we have to satisfy the base first, the foundation, and then we can satisfy something that's a little smaller that goes on top, something a little smaller goes on top, and so on, till we reach the peak of the pyramid. And that we can't reach the peak until we have our most basic needs met. Self-actualization is Maslow's term for the inborn drive to develop all of one's talents and capabilities. That I want to actualize myself, that who I think I am and who I want to be, I want to create that in reality. I want to express that in the most genuine sense of the term. That's self-actualization. Now here's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have physiological needs on the very bottom. Again, that we can't do anything in life until we're satisfied at a level of hunger, thirst, and homeostasis. That just basic kind of balance in the world physiologically must be met before we can even move on to safety or love, or anything else. Safety needs, this is the need to feel secure and safe, to seek pleasure and to avoid pain. So once we've met our hunger and thirst and other needs, that we can move on to feeling safe and secure. We have food on the table, we have water, clean water to drink. Now we can start to look out for our safety. Belonging and love needs come up next. This is our desire to affiliate with others, to be accepted, and to give and receive affection. So again, after our physiological needs, after our safety needs are met, then we can start to work on loving each other, and to feel um, uh, that we belong, and to receive and give affection. Esteem needs. This is the need to achieve, to be competent, to gain approval, and to excel. So this is the first point where we actually begin to see quite a bit of self-actualization emerge. That we want to achieve, we want to be competent and gain approval from others. We want to demonstrate mastery along developing who we are, and as a person, and developing our self-concept. Because lastly, once we've met all those needs, we begin to work on self-actualization when we find self-fulfillment and we realize one's potential. That then you're just firing on all cylinders, and you're becoming exactly the person that you set out to be. Now, considering these different levels of the pyramid, think about an example such as domestic violence, and where that might be a disruption on this pyramid. So we have a couple living at home, where they have uh, food on the table, they have water to drink, and generally maybe a sense of balance in that, they both work, or one person works, and there's kind of routine, and there's not constant disruption of the lifestyle, of the ability to find food to eat, or good water to drink. However, the couple could be in a relationship that perhaps maybe seems a bit loving, but if there erupts a need for safety, if domestic violence occurs, and the one particular spouse does not feel secure and safe, that they cannot avoid pain and seek pleasure, if they're being controlled, and aren't able to seek that self-actualization and to develop who they are as a person, then it's going to be difficult for belonging and love needs to be met, let alone esteem needs, or self-actualization. That once there's a disruption at the level of safety, it's difficult to move on to the next various levels, because you're coming home to an unsafe environment. and that's absolutely going to be distracting and significantly preventing you in focusing on your goals. So just one example of how Maslow would explain a disruption occurring in the hierarchy and the importance of basic needs being met before you can progress on to another level. So some pros is that many concepts are incorporated into successful therapy. That the idea that Rogers posited of unconditional positive regard is trained into mental health workers all around the world. Essentially a basic tenet of psychotherapy, so that we need to essentially accept our clients for, uh, not necessarily accept them for who they are, but to provide that kind of basic positive emotion that I know you're going to be successful at this. Because once we begin to uh, communicate negativity, that's absolutely going to limit their potential for success. It's also one of the first to be rigorously researched. Rogers himself had rooms filled with tapes that he had recorded of sessions and was always seeking to better himself as a clinician. He was uh, a huge supporter of empirical research and demonstrating results and making sure that uh, therapy techniques were universal in terms of effectiveness. That we could, if we were training 100 psychologists in a particular technique or way of developing therapy or delivering therapy, that we would find uh, success across most of great vast majority of those 100 psychologists, um, uh, especially regardless of who they see as a client. So Rogers really wanted to better himself as a clinician as well as better those around him. However, some cons, there are some naive assumptions that this is kind of the Care Bear theory, as that term gets tossed around a bit later on in psychology, that this is kind of the feel-good theory that we just believe that each other that we're good people and that we're going to be successful and all's going to be right in the world if we just kind of be nice to each other or whatnot, or at least be genuine. And while I kind of agree with that to a degree, I can understand the naivete of it, that it doesn't account for necessarily some people who habitually just cannot function in society. There's some kind of poor testability. As much as Rogers loved research, that it's genuinely a lesser research theory in the present day, and it's difficult to test someone's personality based on how their needs are met. For example, like Maslow's hierarchy. Similarly, Rogers doesn't have a clear kind of stage set of development like Freud did or some other theorists, where we can say here's a disruption at this point in life, or here is a stage that needs work or whatnot. Um, Rogers was a very kind of basic development. That he developed a kind of basic theory of how we are just trying to be who we want to be. And that's kind of difficult to develop a test about. It's also pretty narrow. Again, just kind of focused on positive psychology. Social cognitive theories, that the personality reflects an individual's interaction with the environment, because it's how people think about the world and interpret what happens to them. Bandura and Rotter are two big social cognitive theorists. It's all about how we are reacting to the world and how we are making sense of the world. Again, cognitively, we think about the term, breaking it down. Our cognition, our thoughts and feelings, and how we're making sense of things is all centered on the social realm. In these in the social cognitive theories, Bandura develops some key terms. Self-efficacy is a person's learned expectation of success. That uh, uh, as we become successful, we're going to continue to expect success, and that's our own self-efficacy. That how much can we be successful in the social world? Reciprocal determinism, these are the cognitions, behaviors, and the environment, that as they interact, they produce a sort of personality, that everything comes together, that our influence from the world around us and our environment, how we behave in that world, and then how we think about the world, all come together to form that personality and who we are. Rotter's key terms, on the other hand, cognitive expectancies, what people expect to happen, that we have a great deal of experience every day. Of course, we're living in a social world, and we have certain expectations of what's going to happen. When that doesn't occur, that can be very disruptive to our understanding of the world and can cause a great deal of anxiety. Reinforcement value is the degree to which people prefer one reinforcer over another. That do you find a greater deal of satisfaction from watching people around, your coworkers being happy, or do you find greater satisfaction from getting that paycheck, which is kind of the primary reinforcer for you and your own kind of preference for that reinforcer. The locus of control is what people consider the source of life's rewards and punishments. So is this something internal? Is it that I can be satisfied with my life and that I am ultimately rewarding myself and punishing myself when things do or don't go my way? Or is it the world around me that's influencing me? That it doesn't matter what I do, the world exists in this certain fashion anyway, and it's going to have its way on me as just kind of like another game piece on the board game of life. And it's important to consider where somebody places the locus of control, because ultimately research shows that people who have an internal locus of control have a generally more successful lifestyle and achieve more of their needs than somebody who just kind of says, well, it's the world acting on me and there's nothing I can do about it. That would be more of an external locus of control. Some pros: it emphasizes how the environment affects and is affected by individuals. It's a great theory for considering our place in the world and the environment that the other theories don't necessarily account for nearly as much. And it meets most standards for scientific research. It's really a well-supported theory for personality development, and it's easier to test because we can test someone's cognitions, we can test their behaviors and observe them, we can see how they act in an environment. The con side is that it's, again, pretty narrow focus. It's still saying that the world is, that all of who we are is based on society and our existence in the environment. And it does ignore unconscious and emotional aspects of personality. That it doesn't say that there's anything hidden, or that there's anything we need to dig for, or that there are these underlying emotions driving us. It's really just pretty much taking people at face value and saying that it was a direct result of the environment. Now, regarding personality assessment, we have 4 methods to measure personality. We have interviews, observations, we have objective tests, like the MMPI, stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and then we have the projective tests, like the Rorschach ink blot test. This is Rorschach here, Herman Rorschach, and some examples of fake ink blots. And the TAT, the Thematic Apperception Test, are examples of projective tests. That these are tests used for a person to project their personality, their thoughts and feelings and whatnot onto these cards. And I don't want to go into this necessarily too much, but this essentially taps into the unconscious mind, because the person just looks at ink blots and just says what they see. The objective tests are mostly fill in the blank, like bubble tests, and how true or false is this for you. This could be a great way to assess for personality, especially because there's some great reliability in across testing people multiple times with a test like the MMPI. Some of the subscales on the MMPI, I would urge you to kind of ignore the clinical scale names. They're pretty archaic and don't necessarily resemble how a psychologist would interpret the results of a test. Pay more attention to the typical interpretations of high scores. The most kind of obvious example of one that has, I think, a horrible name, but is useful for, but again gets it interpreted in a bit of a different way, is number 4, psychopathic deviant. Think about somebody who's a psychopath and they're deviating from the world and how terrible this could be. But really, it's just about being rebellious and being nonconformist. So how much does a person kind of go against the grain of society? Now, of course, somebody who scores at the topmost level, all the way off the charts kind of thing, maybe they could earn a term like psychopathic deviant, but for the 99.99% of people who are going to take this test and have any kind of elevation at all, not even, for anyone who takes this test whether they elevate it or not. We're not looking at to which degree are they psychopathic deviates. It's more of, again, how much are they kind of going along with society versus kind of rubbing against it. And again, the rest of these, psychasthenia, schizophrenia, all of that, they're more about determining whether someone is withdrawn, reclusive, fearful, or how suggestible are they, things like that. This is when somebody produces a profile on the MMPI, we look at we will look at scales individually, but we will also look at them kind of across the test in general and try to make sense of the person's various elevations or lack of elevations on the test. The great thing about the MMPI is it comes with validity scales. So we can actually tell based on how you answer whether you're lying or not, or whether you're confused about perhaps the way you're answering, or if you're being defensive, or if you're just you maybe don't understand and you can't say what the answers are. That's all built into the test, and it's very difficult for a person taking this test to pick up on it and to fool the validity scales. So it's a great way to do a validity check and say, yes, this person took the test in a valid way, and it's likely going to be a genuine representation of their personality as they understand it. So, some methods of personality development, our personality assessment, what are some pros and cons? Interviews and observations, talking to people. Some pros, it gets us some insights. Some cons, it can be very time consuming and expensive. If all we can do is talk to somebody and observe them, that requires a great deal of time, great deal of resources. An objective test, it's very standardized. These tests like the MMPI or IQ tests and behavior scales and whatnot have been tested tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times, in terms of research that supports it. And so we can standardize the information and say that compared to tens of thousands of people who've taken this, you fell into this category of people, maybe these few hundred or these several thousand. That's great for finding the trends in terms of how valid the scale is. Some cons is that it may be possible on some scales on some tests to deliberately deceive the tester. The person could have some sort of social desirability bias. So, I don't want to admit to having all these issues. If there's a question in front of me that says sometimes sometimes I think people are out to get me, true or false. Well, I know by looking at it, if I mark true, that would communicate a problem to this test provider. So maybe I'll mark false. So it's pretty see-through in terms of what the questions are asking, and somebody could fool the test like a little bit. But again, we have the validity checks to make sure that the person isn't faking bad or faking good, that they're not painting an overly rosy picture. The validity scales will tell us that. And lastly, we have the projective tests. Some pros is that it can give us a great deal of insights into the person and the way they're thinking, the way that they understand the world. That it's very difficult for a person to defend against a projective test or to fake bad or fake good or whatnot. The con is that there's low reliability and validity. This kind of depends on the test. The Rorschach is an excellent test that is still very, very popular, very well researched and supported. But other tests like the TAT, despite its popularity, does have some questionable empirical support, and it can be difficult again for clinicians for the test to be reliable, because as we hand the results to different clinicians, they may be interpreting things just a little bit differently. Again, the Rorschach kind of set aside, that is really an excellent test, but for others, 5 different clinicians could be looking at the projective results and have 5 different interpretations of it. That kind of throws into question the reliability and validity of such a measure. Lastly, on today's lecture, I want to touch on reliability and validity. These terms get tossed around a lot. Just want to kind of drive home the definitions of each. Reliability, that this is the measure of the consistency and reproducibility of a test scores when a test is given again. If I'm going to give it 10 times, how many out of the 10 times will the person get the exact same results, the exact same score? If it's 10 out of 10, that's a very reliable test. We can rely on its ability to be consistent. However, if I give it 10 times and we get 10 different scores, that's not very reliable at all. Now, the validity measure, that this is the ability of a test to measure what it was designed to measure. So how essentially accurate is it? How much is it truly representing that which we're trying to test? How valid is it? If it's not a very valid test, I could say, which of these colors do you prefer? And out of an array of 5 colors, and you pick red, and all of a sudden I start to pull out all these different these personality factors about who you are, as well as your hopes for the future and all that, just because you picked a color. It's not a very valid test, and because there's just no research that supports color preference and life outlook and all of that stuff. So validity is kind of the accuracy, the truthfulness of the test. Reliability is just, can we get the same results over and over again through retesting? So that's today's lecture on personality development and personality assessment. And again, next time we'll jump into anxiety and depression disorders in just a couple of days. So until next time, I'll see you guys later.